In a translation of his work, Basic Verities, Prose and Poetry, French Catholic writer Charles Bagoy wrote, quote, "Homer is new this morning, and perhaps nothing is as old as today's newspaper," close quote. Dr. Jennifer Frey on the role of classic literature in the modern era now. My name is Tod Worner, and this is the Evangelization Culture Podcast from Word on Fire. Dr. Jennifer Frey is a professor of philosophy at the University of Tulsa. She previously served as the inaugural dean of the Honors College at the University of Tulsa, and before coming to there, she was an associate professor of philosophy at the University of South Carolina, where she was also a Peter and Bonnie McCausland Faculty Fellow in the College of Arts and Sciences. Prior to her tenure at Carolina, she was a collegiate assistant professor of the humanities at the University of Chicago and a junior fellow of the Society for the Liberal Arts. Jennifer earned her PhD in philosophy at the University of Pittsburgh and her BA in philosophy and medieval studies with a classics minor at Indiana University, Bloomington. In 2015, she was awarded a multi-million-dollar grant from the John Templeton Foundation titled Virtue, Happiness, and the Meaning of Life. She has published widely on virtue and moral psychology, and she has edited 3 academic volumes on virtue and human action: Self-Transcendence and Virtue, Perspectives from Philosophy, Psychology, and Theology, Practical Truth, and Practical Wisdom. Her writing has been featured in Breaking Ground, First Things, Fair Forward, Image, Law and Liberty, The Point, USA Today, and the Wall Street Journal. She lives with her husband, Chris, and 6 children in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Jen Frey, welcome.
I'm so happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Segment 1, The Boys with the Books. On January 30th, 2026, Sean O'Keefe, a high school student, sent a tweet titled, "I love this book," where he holds up a copy of Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov and says, quote, "I must say I am hooked on this book. I can't put it down. I'm 154 pages in, and I love the way Dostoevsky can just tell his story," close quote. For 90 seconds, he unfolds Dostoevsky's style, characters, plot, and why this book is transforming him as a reader. This tweet is from one of many young men sharing their love of classic literature. So Jen, so great to have you here. We've seen a lot of different trends on Twitter, which is now known as X, over the many years, but I'm not sure anyone quite expected young men expressing deep affection for classic literature. So what is going on?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think it's wonderful. I think it's wonderful anytime that we see young people, regardless of gender, really just being excited about books. We always hear that the age of reading is over. Young people have no attention span. Nobody reads anymore. They just go to AI and get chapter summaries and then pass the test, or they have artificial intelligence, write their essays for them, and that there's no capacity to experience books, to experience the goods and pleasures internal to reading. And there's no desire, right? This is the narrative that we always hear. And I think there's obviously something to it. It's tracking some reality. It's not really my experience with young people.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah.
As a professor and as a dean that built a college and a curriculum around reading thousands of pages a semester, what I found is a passion for reading and for ideas and for community around reading and sharing and arguing about ideas. And so I just think that it's great. As to like what's going on with kind of great books, internet land, I think that people are sort of starved for something that is deeply meaningful to them in relation to their education. education in this country, with some obvious exceptions, has been completely instrumentalized or externalized. So the goods that are internal to a liberal education have not been articulated or explicitly sought, but rather goods that are external to the practice, such as, I don't know, getting a credential so that you can get a job, etc. These are what people focus on. Really, from kindergarten on up, children are taught that their education is for the sake of work.
Yeah.
What the classical world would call a menial education. And when you are taught that you're receiving a menial education, where that just means you're being taught for work,
Yeah.
people don't really understand why they need to read difficult literature. And they're not, and the way that they're often taught literature doesn't spark any joy or meaning or purpose. And so maybe it's not surprising that it's not fun or interesting for them. And what I find so fascinating and telling and important about great books initiatives that are completely outside of the academy and somewhat spontaneous. These are just people like getting online and being like, wow, this book is really amazing, and let me tell you about it.
Yeah.
Is that they're having an experience that they really want to share. But they don't find that naturally within our systems of education anymore. It has to happen outside of it. And I think that's really an indictment of our current our current model of education. I think it's an indictment of higher education. I really think that these people are sort of witnesses to something that has been lost and that needs to be recovered. As to like why exactly it's happening, I don't know. I mean, personally, I believe that there's like a basic human need there, right? That's going to express itself regardless of like whatever we're doing.
Yeah.
And so it's not surprising that it bubbles up. And I would like to see more of it. You know, I just want to encourage young people to go deeper, to really cultivate their capacity for attention, which has been decimated for all of us by current modes of technology, which are set up to decimate our capacity for attention. I really just want to encourage them, you know, to cultivate that, to see the fruits of that cultivation, because really we're talking about trying to lead a contemplative life, trying to actualize in ourselves those highest human capacities, which are rational ones. So it's a beautiful thing. Beautiful thing.
You know, it makes me think of Flannery O'Connor's line, you know, I tell a story because a statement would be inadequate, she said at one point. It also makes me think about Jesus employing the parable of the Good Samaritan as a wonderful colored out adjunct to the notion of love your neighbor as yourself. There's something about the notion of story that embodies, obviously, the deeper truths, the deeper ethics, the deeper ways and virtues that we should strive to abide by. I want to ask you, as we've fallen away as a society from attention to reading long novels, the Dostoevskys, the Tolstoys, and others, and many others beyond just the Russians, obviously, but there seems to be a loss of, if it's Edmund Burke that said it, if it's Russell Kirk that said it, if it's many people that said it, the loss of the notion of the moral imagination. What happens to a society when a moral imagination that is cultivated and formed by reading great works of literature atrophies? Do you have a sense about that?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a disaster. And, you know, of course, we have imaginative capacities, and they will be actualized by something.
Mm.
And so if it's not great books or great art generally, or convivial, serious conversation about ideas and politics and things that matter, it will be shaped by the algorithm.
Mm.
It will be shaped by pop culture. There's a vacuum there that's going to be filled by something.
Yeah.
And, if you spend any amount of time on social media, you're just going to be very concerned very quickly for our culture, because it's just, it's just like a bestiary of, various pathologies.
Yeah.
And the algorithm starts feeding you sort of what what you are wanting to look at.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's kind of, we know this, and people are going into some really dark spaces to get attention. And, I recently basically lived in the hospital for a long time, wasn't getting much sleep, would find myself at like 3 a.m. scrolling Instagram, which I don't recommend. But it's a bit like watching a train wreck, and sometimes it's hard to extract yourself from it. I find channels of Disney moms. So these are people who just go to Disney World every day.
Mm.
And they've like moved to Disney, and their whole life is like a weird fantasy.
Wow.
I found doll moms,
Mm.
which are women who buy dolls and pretend that they're mothers, like full time. And these people have millions of followers.
Wow.
It's really incredible. Or just people, I don't know. It's so disturbing.
Yeah.
To see how people are kind of filling that void.
Yeah.
But my point is, it's going to be filled by something.
Yeah.
And I think for a long time now, we have failed to take seriously something that was just obvious to people forever, which is that education is about forming a person.
Yeah.
Right? It's not just learning a set of skills that you need to get a job and make money. Nobody thought that until very recently. And it's so clear once you stop to think about it, just how impoverished a conception of education that is. Yet it is the default. It is the standard. In my state of Oklahoma, right? Our governor just announced an executive order that we will rigorously assess higher education based on the amount of money you make on graduation and the kind of job you have. So again, it's just a complete externalization of so-called higher education, and it's not partisan. I'm constantly reminding people that the first person to put forward this idea of measuring study in our universities by how much money you make 5 years out of graduation was Barack Obama, right? And this is one of the few kind of places where Republicans and Democrats seem to really want to come together.
Yeah,
which
sadly,
absolutely destroy our classical notion of the liberal arts. And so this is something that I've been writing and speaking about for a long time, because I think it's civilization destroying stuff. And we see the fruits of it all around us. But we don't seem to be able to connect the dots in the relevant way. So when I see a teenage boy on his bed excited about Dostoevsky and devoting his Instagram channel to that rather than looks maxing or just being stupid to get attention, I'm thrilled.
Yeah. Your heart soars when you see that. Well, and you make me think of there was Donald Kagan, who was as you probably know, I think it was a professor at Yale who ended up putting together a work on Thucydides and the history of the Peloponnesian War, and it's considered, I think, one of the greatest interpretations of the 20th century, if not going back even further. He gave a lecture about the notion of the loss of the formation. I love the word formation, like you, more than just education, but the formation, not just imparting facts, but cultivating character, the formation of the complete person. And it's interesting because when I'm teaching medical students and residents, a lot of the times I'm saying that you need to be as good of a student of human nature as you are of the human body, which means you need to read not just, Robbins Pathology or Up to Date or the New England Journal of Medicine. You need to read Dostoevsky, you need to read Jane Austen, you have to read Dante, because you're going to, or King Lear, you Shakespeare, you're going to run into these characters in your office that are going to be King Lear or a lost Dante or Elizabeth Bennet, and there's so many lessons, and it's not just for utilitarian purposes. You should just get lost in these works, but it rounds you out as a person to understand. I'm not just an anatomist or a chemist. I'm dealing with human clay, myself, my own, and my patients. I need to understand them as a person and not just a problem, so to speak. So, like what you're doing, and I think I just commend people to your podcast. Is it Sacred and Profane Love? Is that what it is? Is it?
In love,
Yes,
yes.
that and all of your many philosophical, but also your treatises on classical education and so on, or classical literature. They're so good. Just Google Jen Frey. Don't spend too much time on the internet, but Google Jen Frey and immerse yourself into it, because you have a lot to say and teach. I want to ask you, Jen, reading classical, so some of the nuts and bolts of kind of the Renaissance, or an intended Renaissance, the forever Renaissance, if you will, of bringing classical literature into the lives of people who are unfamiliar with it. So reading classical literature, it obviously requires work. And so I want to ask you to start off with looking at this, 16-year-old guy talking about, Dostoevsky. Is there ever, and this is, understand the spirit of my question, is there ever a concern that without proper guidance, the young and the inexperienced that are dabbling in the classics might find themselves discouraged and walk away from the classical literature, never to return again?
Yeah, I mean, I think, what's really important more than guidance is community.
Mm,
I think that and this is why, when I was thinking about how to build a college curriculum, I wanted there to be a shared basis of learning. So for 12 credit hours, I wanted them to all be reading the same books, right? And after that, they can express their beautiful autonomy. But I wanted them to have a shared learning experience, so that because they lived together
yeah.
in the dorms, I wanted them to go back to that living space and be able to talk to anyone about Plato's Symposium, not just the random people that ended up in their class.
Mm,
Because I think that um, people don't just consume art, right? They are being formed by art,
mhm.
whether they recognize it or not. And that is going to go back into their understanding of themselves, and in particular, what they can imagine for themselves and what they want for themselves. So when we think about like forming that moral imagination, we're talking about forming their capacities to deliberate about what to do and how to live and things like that.
Mhm.
And when we talk about self knowledge, I think we're mostly talking about how not just we interpret ourselves, but how other people interpret ourselves to us. We don't act in a vacuum. We
Yeah.
act in a world where our acts are interpreted and received by other people. And the same thing for our thoughts, right? We put them out there and we're like, wow, didn't expect people
Yeah.
to react that
Yeah.
way. Maybe they have a point. And the kinds of what I would call intellectual friendship, which is a kind of friendship where the shared life together, is the cultivation, the pursuit of truth, right? Shared pursuit of truth or wisdom, where a big part of wisdom is self knowledge, just coming to understand yourself. That is I mean, I'm a philosopher, but that is like the best kind of friendship.
Yeah, yeah, it really
It's
is.
so amazing.
Yeah.
And there's so much depth to it. And I really think that's what young people need more than they need an expert in the room
Mm,
who, it's good to have that. And there are resources out there for people to access. And I don't want to make myself totally useless.
yeah, of course.
Like I want to have some role in this, but I also don't want to oversell what my role is, because I think that it's a bad model of education to think of it in the way that the sophists did,
Yeah.
right? When we go back and we read Plato, it's really kind of a battle between Socrates and the sophists. That's at least three quarters Plato's writings. And, part of his beef with the sophists is that they're just giving these beautiful speeches. And then it turns out that if you start to engage them in what he calls dialectical conversation, where you're like, oh, all right, you said this. What about this? And then the whole thing just very quickly falls apart,
Yeah.
and Socrates refutes them, and they just kind of walk away, right? They're angry about it. And what Socrates is trying to say the best kind of education is this art of dialectic, which is conversation. And in particular, it's conversation where the opposite is taken up and taken seriously. And then if it's refuted, then we can set it aside. But if it's not, we have to continue to take it seriously. And this is a very, conversation is a personal thing. And this comes out very clearly in the Socratic dialogues, because people's, kind of flaws become clear in these exchanges. And but the art of dialectic is what you eventually need to engage in if you're going to go from the cave of shadows and appearances up to wisdom. And I think that's really the fundamental thing, is not just the reading. Yes, you need to do the reading. But I would say that the reading is necessary, but not sufficient.
Yeah.
You need to do the talking and the dialectic. And that is where some very beautiful friendships will form if you are doing it in the right spirit, because other people can help you not only interpret a text, but interpret yourself and the way that you're reacting to a text, etc.
I love that notion of it, because I've sent something out on social media at one point or the other and got that reaction that I'm like, whoa, I didn't expect that. And it does make you have some introspection that someone has reflected me back to me. And I'm like, you know what? I guess I see that point. I want to ask you, Heraclitus purportedly said, no man ever steps in the same river twice, for it's not the same river and he's not the same man. Speaking from a personal experience, what becomes of Hamlet read by a ninth grader and then Hamlet read again by a 49-year-old?
Thank you for asking that. Because something that I have experienced in the classical education world, which is something that I, of course, support wholeheartedly, is I will run into parents who say the following to me. They look at my curriculum and they will say, well, little Jimmy read Homer in the 6th grade. And so
he's done with it.
He's done with that.
Oh my gosh.
And I just, this sort of thing is obviously a test of my patience. And sometimes my patience is really strong and other days it's not. But it really says something about how deep the rot is, that even a parent who makes the sacrifices to send their kids to a classical school doesn't actually understand the concept of habit and formation and development and kind of what we're doing. And, I'll try to explain to people that I really think it's wonderful that little Jimmy read Homer in the 6th grade. But he didn't really understand it.
Yes. Preach.
And it is going to be a very different reading when he is surrounded by other 18-year-olds who actually don't necessarily share the monoculture of your classical school, who will read and interpret this differently, who will have a different lens, and he will have to learn to respond to that. And not only that, but we'll have to take in a single semester from Homer to Cicero, right? And start to see a red thread kind of, between really long historical stretches. And, because he's already read Homer, he's going to be bringing a lot to that. But he's not just done reading.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I always try to remind people something that we just know, it's a fact. It's not speculative. The most formative period in a person's life in this stage of history, this wouldn't have been true of other stages, but it's true now, are 18 to 22. That is when you solidify your adult identity. And that's when you're in college for many people. And so the idea that, right now is when we give up really on liberal learning and we just, he's just going to be an engineer or whatever. That's a disaster. It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't conform to what we know about human nature in its current configuration. And we need to pay attention to the fact that this is really the most critical formative time. And you can't, and it's also when little Jimmy is not under your watchful eye anymore. Right?
Yeah.
And that's good, right? We want that separation, which is necessary to forming an adult identity. But you can't just give up on, and you can't, again, externalize or instrumentalize higher education. Because if you do that, then it's only higher in cost. That's it.
Yeah.
It's just not, it's not higher in any other deeper or more meaningful sense. So yeah, it's a very different experience. And this tells us something about Homer, right? It tells us something about certain texts, that they are so rich and timeless. They are truly timeless in the sense that they transcend, ancient Hellenic culture, but they also transcend, the time span of the times in which I've read them, so that I see things, right, as a 49-year-old that I didn't see as a 19-year-old. And that's why it's good, in fact, to reread.
Totally.
I mean, I tell people, because it's true, if you only read a great novel once, you probably didn't understand it. And they don't want to hear that.
No, it's true.
But it's true. I always tell my students, read everything twice. Just read it twice. And it's, first of all, it's gonna be better the second time you read it. The first time, you're just trying to get a sense of it.
Yeah.
Right? The second time is when you really go deep.
See, this is a little bit, I say this to my medical students. I tease, I said exactly what you said. Now, when I was in 9th grade, I read Hamlet. I went to the Guthrie Theater here in Minneapolis and I watched Hamlet. I wrote a Blue Book essay, got an A on it, and I had really no idea what was going on. And
Yeah.
and then I've read it several times since, and it's a different story as a college student. It's a different story when you have your first job. It's a different story after you've fallen in love and been married, when you've had a child, when you've lost a parent, if you've been sick, if you don't like your job or do like your job. You're just a different person. And so you're encountering this same work that's unfolding to you in a new way because you have experience that you didn't have when you were in ninth grade. And God bless every high school teacher teaching this stuff. And some kids are precocious and so on and so forth. But to your point about little Jimmy leaving Homer behind in sixth grade, it's sort of like you're leaving behind this trove of wisdom that you just could not temporally arrive at yet because you're a sixth grader. And to say I've conquered it. Well, did you though? And so I just feel like there's a lot of wonderful books on the shelves, read once, if at all, that are just begging for us to re-enjoy or reapproach because the wisdom is just bursting there if we only pick it up and read. So I love what you said about that.
And I would also just add that these books, these sort of great masterworks, they're part of a tradition.
Mm-hmm.
And as you progress in that tradition, it enriches every part of that tradition because now you see it in light of this greater whole, because you see how other people are kind of digesting and processing Homer and putting it into their works and carrying certain strands of it forward. And you're also, if you're in the right context, you're discussing it with other people who are pointing out things that you didn't see, or maybe offering an interpretation that puzzled you. And that brings you back, right, to another time reading it. And then, other people can open up a text for you. And those people can also be, canonical figures, or they could be the person in your class, or they could be your teacher, etc. But it's not, education is not something that has this stopping point where you can say, I'm done with it.
Yeah.
Right. Any more than like justice or charity is a stopping point where you're like, oh, well, I did justice. Now I can move on. No, you're never done with it. And you're never done cultivating your mind. You're never done with it. And insofar as you stop doing it, you're just denying yourself. You're denying yourself human flourishing.
Yeah.
Why would you do that? But nobody talks to students that way about their education. Nobody says to them, well, yeah, I mean, you could not do the reading, but you'd be denying yourself human flourishing. Like, why would you do that? Nobody says that to them. But I'll tell you, when you do say that to them, their eyebrow shoots up.
Yes.
They're like, what are you talking about? You're like, let me tell you. So a lot of it, and I wrote about this in the New York Times, a lot of the problem is the way that we present education to young people. And frankly, I think it's not a surprise that they reject it. If you tell a young person that they should read Dostoevsky because it's a form of mental gymnastics that might help them be a better coder, I think they're going to look at that and be like, well, there's a lot of other stuff that might do that doesn't involve keeping up with the 10 different names of every character, So it's a bad sell. It's shortchanging everyone involved. But I will tell you, in my experience, higher education administrators and leaders seem to just want to double down on failure on this point. Very hard to break through the blinders that they seem to have on.
Segment 2, the state of the academy. George Orwell once noted, quote, "One has to belong to the intelligentsia to believe things like that. No ordinary man could be such a fool," close quote. William F. Buckley Jr. quipped, quote, "I would rather be governed by the first 2,000 people in the Boston telephone directory than by the 2,000 people on the faculty of Harvard University," close quote. And Chico Marx, in his famous role as the crafty Ciccolini in the famous Marx Brothers film Duck Soup, asked, quote, "Are you going to believe me or your own lying eyes?" Close quote. Jen, why have intellectuals, and often many intellectuals found in academic higher education, why have intellectuals been the targets of such derision, and is it justified?
Yeah, what a great question, and kind of it's a complicated one.
Yeah.
I'm an intellectual.
Yes, you're a good one. You're one of the good ones.
These are my people, and um, I would say, I would say this: if you really want to understand intellectuals and sort of how this particular animal came to be, you have to look at the university and how it's structured and what its incentive structures are. And I think that's very valuable. It's also kind of depressing. And one thing that is just a fact is that faculty really only have their reputation. That is kind of all that you have. And when that's all that you have, like, you'll only advance insofar as you can demonstrate, right, the power of your reputation, where that's understood professionally. Then it's no surprise that your ego is very fragile, and that you have so narrowed, right, your set of peers or people that you are willing to interact with, because these are the people who can help advance you in your career, which is a matter of perception of the quality of your scholarship. Nobody cares about teaching. It's a fact. And the research university was constructed so that it was just an afterthought. We have become knowledge workers in a knowledge economy, and we either produce the knowledge or we don't. And people either cite us or they don't. That's it. There's I just finished my annual review. I don't get credit for my podcast. I don't get credit for talking to the hoi polloi. I don't get credit for writing for the hoi polloi. It's not recognized.
Wow.
And, that really needs to change. And I don't think it will, but it really needs to change, because it has lots of bad effects for everyone. We need to pay more attention to undergraduate teaching. In fact, that should be a very important thing. It's not. So I think. So I don't want to just be critical
Sure.
of my tribe, because I think in some ways, we're just deformed because we have to be deformed. But I'll also say that, as we, again, as we think, because some of the things that it's so easy to make fun of us for is that we speak in technical jargon, seemingly for no reason. We write things that no one reads. We just seem to only be talking to such a narrow sphere. And we do that because we have to, in a way. Or we're incentivized to do that. And that is an institutional problem, and the modern research university in general was always split between kind of the technical scientific side, where outputs and innovation and things like metrics like this make more sense, and the humanities, where these metrics make less sense. But we decided that there had to be a kind of uniform way of assessing. And I think historically what happened is that the humanities were shoehorned into a more scientific frame. And it's been bad for us.
Yeah.
I think it's been bad for us. I think it's been bad for students. I think it's been bad for culture. I also, in my own ways, have tried to fight it, but I think it's safe to say I've been pretty unsuccessful. So,
Well,
so I'm not
keep
sure.
up the good fights. Keep up a good fight. We need some valiant people with shields and spears. There's no question. Well, and Jen, on that note, you make me think of this 2013 debate. I don't know if you remember seeing this. It was between Harvard psychologist Steven Pinker and literary critic Leon Wieseltier. It was this sparks flew splashed across. I think
I'm on Team Leon. Just for the record.
What's that?
I'm definitely going to be on Team Leon.
Well, and it was about the notion of the role of science in quote unquote purifying the humanities. And this is, I think, there's 3 different articles. I think it was the New Republic. It might have been the London Review of Books. It might have been the New York Review of Books, what have you. But there was this notion that Steven Pinker kind of, I mean, if I may say so, it was kind of a haughty notion that by scientifically analyzing the evolutionary phenotypes or the quantitative number of syllables in a Baudelaire novel or what have you, you're going to make the humanities better. And you just see Wieseltier is just shaking his head. So my question for you on that note is the scientizing of that which is, if in other words, it's not scientizable. I mean, we're talking about something that doesn't fit neatly into the box of the scientific method and metrics and all that kind of stuff. On the note of what you're saying about sort of what humanities getting the short end of the stick when you stick it into the box of overly scientizing it, what is the line between fruitful literary criticism and kind of scorched earth scientific deconstruction?
That is a complicated question. It's a good question. Goodness. Let me see how I can tackle this. So I think that kind of literary criticism that goes more towards the deconstruction side, I think it's less of a problem of it being scientistic.
Okay.
And more of it a problem of just being really disastrously bad philosophy.
Yeah.
So, and what I would say about scientism, the way that I would define scientism is that it is a philosophy pretending to be an empirical hypothesis, right? So, I was recently on a panel at the annual Heterodox Academy conference in New York City, and it was like me and Lou Menand at Harvard and John McWhorter at Columbia, and then some biologist at the University of Chicago. And somebody asked us about truth. And because, Heterodox Academy is like the purpose of the university should be truth and not activism, and et cetera, which of course is correct. But it's amazing that we even have to have a debate on argument.
Yeah.
Come on, but then the biologist says in a totally serious way, in which he expects no pushback, is he says, well, the humanities don't have access to the truth. Only science has access to the truth. Oh my
gosh.
And, again, patience is maybe not my
forte,
strongest virtue. And I got kind of mad and pointed out that, the claim that only science has access to truth is either true or false, and science itself couldn't possibly demonstrate that by its own lights. And he had nothing to say.
No.
In part because it was clear that he didn't care, right? I mean, but also he had just never read any philosophy, I don't think. And this is another institutional problem with our current university system, is that it is set up to produce scholarship where that is specialization, right? So, I mean, Max Weber said in his famous lecture on scholarship as vocation, or the scholar as vocation, he just said, like, we have entered like a period of hyper specialization and we're never getting out of it.
Mm.
And that was that was true.
Yeah.
And again, that has to do with how the German Research University organized itself and then reproduced itself in this country. The 19th century, the long 19th century is when every college in this country became a university that was explicitly based on the Humboldt model. That rewards hyper specialization. And so, of course, you could become an important biologist without ever touching philosophy. And of course, you could, in an incredibly flat-footed, uncritical way, accept scientism, which is an epistemology and a metaphysics, without having any sense that you have assumed a metaphysics and an epistemology that you yourself don't have the resources to explain.
Good one.
And so it's frustrating.
Yeah.
It's frustrating because that's the way the whole system is set up. And it makes it difficult for creatures of the university to really act together and say basic things like, yes, our mission is truth. Because you have half a wing that just thinks, no, actually, only my discipline accesses.
Yeah.
Whatever you guys are doing, like, it seems cool, but it couldn't be real.
Yeah, exactly.
And so I can't remember what your question was, but things like this really frustrate me.
Well, and I want to. It's sort of you're just hitting the nail on the head. By the way, it sounds like you were Socrates, and as biologist was a sophist who basically wanted to walk away from the questions and say, let's get to the root of your. Well, I don't know what to do about that. So, no, this is to my way of thinking. Again, the deep essence of the benefit of the cultivation of virtue and the formation of the mindset of how to navigate the vicissitudes of life and so on, that gets threatened by a hyper scientizing or hyper analytical approach that just kind of basically kills something so it can analyze the corpse and say, behold, we've saved it. So you're touching on it, I guess, is what I'm saying. I want to go one step further on the notion of literary criticism. I've read over time, and I don't know if it's true or it's an urban legend, that at certain vaunted academic institutions, English majors, they read literary criticism without reading the literature. And my question for you is, and A, is that true, or is that just kind of a falsehood? But B, how can one know Shakespeare without intimately knowing Shakespeare's works?
Yeah. So English is not my field, in part because when I tried to be an English major, I realized that no one in the English department seemed to love literature, which is like why I was there. And I drifted over to philosophy, but I did still take maybe 5 literature courses during my undergraduate years. And I would say what I experienced was an approach to literature that was hypercritical, hyper-political, and didn't in any way connect with the reasons I wanted to read books. And nobody wanted to talk about the story.
Yeah.
Which was like
wow.
the thing that I wanted to talk about. They weren't interested in that. They were interested in the politics surrounding the story. Yeah. They were interested in the histories. They just seemed to, I don't know how else to say it, except they didn't seem to love books, but I did. Yeah. And so in philosophy, the reason why I gravitated to philosophy is that they were interested in the book, in the sense that if I took a class on Spinoza, we weren't just talking about, in fact, we spent very little time talking about the historical or political context. It was just like, what on earth is he saying?
Yeah. Yeah.
And just looking at the text, it was just keep your head in the text and try to understand this argument. And that was so valuable for me and was the kind of training that I wanted. I wanted to know how to read a text. And I started to read because I was interested in philosophy. I started to read some literary criticism, and I was just shocked at, frankly, I just thought it was bad, and completely divorced from the norms that I experienced in the philosophy department, where you had to have an argument. Your argument had to like be logical and clear
Yeah.
and be subject to refutation. And I wasn't finding that in the literary criticism that I was reading. It was just like people saying stuff. And I was like, well, maybe that's interesting, but I don't know. Like, what's your argument? I don't actually see one. And so I felt very frustrated just as an intellectual experience. And I think I would really like to see literature kind of return to, I would say, like previous practices. You know, it used to be the case that there were still some people from the old guard, people like, you know, Harold Bloom, for example. But they were really hated.
Yeah, they were. Seriously.
But I also think in a general way, you know, by their fruits you shall know them.
Yeah.
And I think students aren't attracted to this, right? The English major has cratered. And I think it'll be interesting to see, you know, how people respond to that. But to me, just generally, you should never let a crisis go to waste, right? Every crisis is fruitful.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean it's pleasant, but every crisis is fruitful. And I think, you know, the study of literature is responding to a real human need.
Yeah.
We will always need our moral imagination to be watered and fed by great art and literature. We just need to figure out the practical infrastructure for that going forward. And we'll see how that plays out. But I just don't think there's much of a future in what's been happening, in my entire adult life.
What's amazing is how the English departments lost a Jen Frey, and for the very reasons that you're describing, it lost you because you simply loved story, you loved literature, and you went there to find it, and it was nowhere to be found. It's interesting. Chesterton, he was once reading a literary critic on Shakespeare, and he says something to the effect that she's very, very bright and very insightful, and I am very simple. I know little of Shakespeare other than the tremendous trifling of simply reading his works, you know, and so there's that.
Yeah.
He also says in this essay, The Orthodoxy of Hamlet, aesthetes have goaded and jaded their artistic feelings. That is, experts in beauty or the aesthetics have goaded and jaded their artistic feelings too much to enjoy anything simply beautiful. They're aesthetes, and the definition of an aesthete is a man or a woman who's experienced enough to admire a good picture, but not inexperienced enough to see it. And John J. Chapman, I'll add one more little append one more thing. John J. Chapman describing what happens to a kid who knew some of the lines from Macbeth and then went and learned in the modern academic setting about Macbeth from a literary deconstruction mode. Chapman lamented, information is the enemy of poetry. And so I think you're speaking to, I mean, I'm not trying to come down. I think there's probably great insights that come from literary criticism and so on and so forth. But it sometimes seems like you've just said a minute ago, somehow the story gets lost.
Yeah. And I do think that there are some really good living critics. Dana Gioia is a wonderful critic. And I think there's a new staff writer from the New Yorker, Becca Rothfeld, who's a philosophy PhD. Huh. I think she's that exceptional literary critic. I think that they're out there. I also want to say that we need literary critics. Literary critics serve an important role in, let us say, the economy of reading or books. Books are struggling generally. There's not a lot of money in books anymore, or maybe I'll say there's not a lot of money in good books anymore.
Yeah.
And that is a kind of cultural crisis as well. And the role that the critic plays, in a healthy, vibrant culture is to this is someone who, in the best case, has cultivated their vision so that they can relate to everyone, what is good and true and beautiful in the artwork, and can bring people into reading it, right? So, like, even if it's hard or challenging, they're able to show what is worthwhile there. And we need those people. Those people are playing an important role for us. If you're reading there was a big controversy recently because the Washington Post got rid of its book section.
Yeah.
And it is sad that one of our major national newspapers, the newspaper of our capital, isn't going to be bothered with books anymore.
Oh, right.
And telling us, this one is really worth reading, engaging, and here's why. And I've done some book criticism for the Wall Street Journal. And, whenever I write a critical piece where critical is not meaning I'm dissing it.
Yeah.
In fact, typically I'm in favor. I am trying to persuade the gentle readers of the Wall Street Journal, all 7 million of them, I think, that this is something they might consider, taking the time to digest. And that's important. It's important for authors. It's important for booksellers. It's important for us. It's a really, we can't give up on these things, I think. But we can articulate a vision for reform and really press on that vision. But, my concern is that a lot of people seem content to just be like, well, books aren't for everyone and people are just moving on. And that's just the way life is. I get really depressed and kind of angry at that perspective.
Hi, I'm Tod Worner, Managing Editor of Evangelization Culture, the journal of the Word on Fire Institute. Word on Fire is a global evangelical community that exists to provide our members with the resources they need to proclaim Christ to a secular culture. Our award-winning quarterly journal, Evangelization Culture, is offered exclusively to Word on Fire Institute members. It's a tangible representation of our mission and goal to lead with beauty in order to bring others to the knowledge of truth. Inside each issue, you'll find writing from premier scholars and inspiring pieces on literature, culture, and daily life from fellow missionaries on the journey to know and serve Christ. Get a copy of the current issue of the Evangelization Culture Journal for free by visiting wordonfire.org/journal. Thank you, and join us in bringing Christ to a hungry culture. Segment 3. What we should read and why. In his essay, Why College Students Are Avoiding the Study of Literature, Northwestern professor Gary Saul Morrison writes, quote, "A few years ago, when I was talking to a group of students, one of them asked why I teach the books I do, and I replied simply that they are among the greatest ever written. Later, one of my colleagues told me she experienced the thrill one hears when a taboo is broken, because it has been orthodoxy among literature professors for some 3 decades that there is no such thing as great literature. There are only things called great literature, they argue, because hegemonic forces of oppression have mystified us into believing in objective greatness, whereas intrinsically Shakespeare is no different from a laundry list or any other document," close quote. So Jen, following on our beginning segment about the rediscovery among these young people of the classic literature, moving into sort of the doldrums and the disappointments that come kind of in the modern academy. Is there such a thing as great literature? And what is your response to those who accuse you of a parochialism in your choices for the canon of the greats?
Of course, there's great literature. I mean, just rejecting standards in the name of equality is, I don't find it a serious view. I'm sorry. I try to be charitable, but it's just not a serious view, and no one can actually hold it consistently. So, and any professor who proclaims that, any radical egalitarian needs to get out of the academy because they're just such hypocrites. It's so fascinating that, the Ivy Leagues are just full of these radical egalitarians. If you were a radical egalitarian, you would hop on over to the community college. And interestingly, no one does. So I just don't take it seriously. I have my limits. Of course, we have standards. Of course, there's good, better, and best. And a laundry list is not Shakespeare. I'm not going to engage that view. But I think there is a lot of discourse around the canon that is serious. There are objections worth taking seriously. And, the canon wars, I think, were at their height in the 90s, which is when I entered college in 1996. And I went to Indiana University. Go Hoosiers.
Yeah, I was going to say Mendoza. I mean, come on.
That's Heis Mendoza. Thank you. But,
not that you have any skin in the game.
He's a saint. I am declaring it. So anyway, and IU, was such a fascinating place to be in the late 90s. The philosophy department was ranked 8th in the world, and the literature department was also definitely top 10. So I was just a lucky Midwestern girl to be there. And I think, sorry, because I've now lost. I got so excited about
Mendoza. I knew that's a distracting.
The question.
Yeah. Just we were talking about the canon of the greats and
the canon.
Yeah.
Sorry,
canon wars. The canon wars.
I got to like Indiana nostalgia.
Yes. You went to a fugue. I get it.
It's been peak lately. Okay, so the canon wars. Yeah, so they were raging, and I can't remember if I was a freshman or a sophomore, but somebody gave me Alan Bloom's Closing of the American Mind. And I was like, this thing is awesome. And I was surprised to learn that it was really terrible to think that was an awesome book. I was very naive. And I would say, to my superiors, like, but where is it wrong?
Yeah.
And they weren't interested in engaging that. It was just kind of like, he's conservative, he's bad. And I was like, it seems true to me.
Yeah.
So it seems true to my lived experience.
Yeah.
And because I myself was encountering, my own forms of disappointment with, my expectations of what college would be and what it was actually like, particularly with respect to the classroom. And but I became aware of the canon wars having read that book, and I was firmly on Bloom's side and have remained there. But I was an outlier, to put it mildly. In the philosophy department, they weren't really having these discussions. I mean, you were going to read Plato and Aristotle and Leibniz and Spinoza and Descartes and Kant and Hegel, and because those were the serious people. And there really was like no discussion about it. Yeah. I think that today in the philosophy department, there would be more of a discussion, but there just wasn't. The late 90s, you could still just get a traditional education in a philosophy department without having any kind of conversation about it. But I think when we think about a canon, we are thinking about something that is flexible, because tradition is always a living tradition, as opposed to a dead tradition is always still developing.
Yeah.
And hopefully the Western tradition is still alive.
Yeah.
It might be on life support, but it's still alive.
Yeah.
And it can come back with proper care. And so it's always like a flexible thing. It's not fixed forever in stone like the 10 Commandments or something.
Yeah.
Those aren't going to change, but our sense of what belongs there can be flexible. When we think about and another thing that I'll say in favor of a canon is that it's really important for culture that there be a shared basis of some kind of shared learning experience.
Yeah.
And we've really lost that. And part of that is a shared set of texts that we engage. Yeah. There's just a value to that generally that I think is really obvious and not scary. It needn't be scary. People are critical of the canon because they feel that it's exclusive. This is where you get it's all dead white men. Personally, when reading epic poems from the ancient world, I don't really think a lot about who wrote them.
Yeah.
In part because they weren't books, right? Like, people forget that the Greek poets were just guys who went around to towns and were like, "Hey, would you like to hear me sing this poem?" People would be like, "Yes." Or they'd be like, "No."
Yeah.
So I think people could just kind of forget what this stuff even is. We don't even know that Homer existed. And also, what does it mean to say he's white? It's just these things don't really, there's a certain amount of silliness there. But also, I think people are worried about the ways that some of these texts have been used or abused in certain contexts. So, Aristotle's views on natural slavery were used to justify slavery, right? And that's not surprising. And so we shouldn't read Aristotle, or we shouldn't make Aristotle canonical. I mean, the thing is, Aristotle transcends all of that. And obviously, we would not be happy for someone to teach a class defending natural slavery now. It's just not a reason to not respect Aristotle for the genius that he obviously was.
Yeah.
And so I think it's important to recognize what people's concerns are, that they're valid, but also to recognize that maybe their attention is directed on the wrong thing. That the thing that really matters is the work.
Yeah.
The thing that survives consistently the millennia is the work, and it survives because it's great.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? It's not just good. It's great. And it also, part of its greatness is the strength of the work itself, but part of it is also its influence.
Yeah.
So there are some great texts that I really dislike. I don't like Hobbes. I think Hobbes is the opposite of everything I think, right? But of course I teach Hobbes. And of course the Leviathan belongs in the canon because it is the or text of liberalism. And we live, the last time I checked, in a liberal democracy.
Yeah.
And if you want to understand how we got where we are, you need to read Hobbes. And the truth is, Hobbes is already in you. Hobbes, you've already internalized so much of Hobbes, and you just have never reflected on it.
Wow.
And I think once people understand that, it becomes easier to accept, a canon is exclusionary. It has to be. And no canon is set in stone and no canon is perfect. Now, I worked for 2 solid years trying to come up with a curriculum. And you just have to make excruciating choices.
Yeah.
And some of the choices you make are just kind of stupid. And you have to make them because you can only read so much
Right.
in a semester.
Right.
And if you are doing it right, you will constantly be telling your students, you should read Descartes.
Yeah.
He's not on the syllabus. There was a lot of tension about that, but he just didn't make it. And you should definitely read it, right? Because I think that if a liberal education has succeeded, the student will understand that they are always a student.
Yeah.
That they are, again, you're never done with it. You've never exhausted it, even if somehow you read all the books. You haven't exhausted that. But I'm very pro canon. I do take seriously some of the criticisms of it. But I think that what's valuable about the canon outweighs some of the concerns that we have about it. I will also say that, most great books, curricula now are more expansive, right? There is kind of more diversity of voices in them. So I think that's a problem that people have taken seriously and have addressed. But it's also the case that the fundamental question you have to answer isn't, is my canon diverse enough? The fundamental question you have to answer at the end of the day is, are these texts truly great in the sense that the work is timeless? And it has in fact been foundational to this tradition. Because that's really what matters. Because if that stops mattering, then the whole canon thing stops mattering.
Very good. Jen, a couple more questions. You're being very generous with your time. Returning to Gary Saul Morrison's essay, Why College Kids Are Avoiding the Study of Literature, he writes, quote, is there something one can learn from literature one cannot learn just as well or better elsewhere? There's an obvious proof that the great novelist knew more about human psychology than any social scientist who ever lived. If psychologists or sociologists or economists understood people as well as George Eliot or Tolstoy did, they could create portraits of people as believable as Middlemarch's Dorothea Brooke or Anna Karenina, but no social scientist has ever come close. Still more important, many disciplines can teach that what we ought to empathize with others, but these disciplines do not involve the actual practice in empathy. Great literature does. And in that respect, its study remains unique among university-taught subjects, close quote. But I also want to counter with a quote from George Steiner, essayist George Steiner, who simultaneously warned, quote, we know now that a man can read Goethe or Rilke in the evening, that he can play Bach and Schubert and go to his day's work at Auschwitz in the morning, close quote. I love the notion and I believe in the notion of proper formation. I believe and I love the notion of great literature figuring centrally into that. What do you say about the circumstances where great literature, ultimately someone emerges from an extraordinary education and they turn out to be a highly cultured monster? There are some people that are saying it's a fool's errand to think that literature can make you into something greater. There are others that say it's ennobling, and yet we still have the human condition as part of who we are, and so it can't do all the heavy lifting. What do you say about that?
Yeah, I mean, what an amazing question. There's a lot that I would say about it. So let me try to say 3 things. One is that when we think about the novel or the short story or the poem, right, we're thinking about art. And I take the view, because I think it's true.
Yes, of course.
I take the view that the basis of art is truth. And so a poem will not merely be musical or melodious or enchanting, but it will also communicate some truth. But it will communicate it in the mode of a poem. And there are different kinds of poems, right? An epic poem and lyric poetry and etc. But so the poem cannot be reduced to its paraphrase. There is the truth of the poem is internal to the form of the art. So you couldn't just get like an AI summary and think that you had experienced the poem. And that has to do with the way that poetry sort of operates on us, and also the ways that it is forming our imagination and not just our thought. So I would say that. I would also say that you're touching on a question that has plagued the West from the start, which is the question of whether or not virtue can be taught. Socrates is obsessed with this question. So many of the Platonic dialogues are centered around this question: can virtue be taught? And it's not obvious that it can. Because if you think about learning, right, there's the teacher and then there's the student. So there's, the student has to receive. And there is freedom there. Not just receive, but interpret and digest and make sense of. All of that process is a matter of personality and human freedom, and the teacher cannot control that. And when we think about the kind of Nazi case that you mentioned, as kind of the highly cultured Nazi, it's important to remember that Nazi ideology was a form of nationalism that saw Germany and the 1,000-year Reich. Germany was the highest expression of human culture, and it was understood racially. And so they are politicizing culture in a very specific sense. And so, yes, they're very proud of German culture, and rightly so. But they are proud of it in the wrong way, right? So the way that they are internalizing this culture is proof to them of the superiority of the Aryan race. And I don't believe that was the truth meant to be communicated through that art. And so they are not really, on some level, like they don't get it.
Yeah.
And this is something that can happen. And this is a kind of theme in a lot of Western literature, kind of like the dangers of reading. There's the famous canto in Dante's Inferno where they are damned by reading poetry. And that's the first time that Dante just faints, because he's like, oh, wait, am I damning people?
Yeah.
And of course, there are so many layers of irony because the Divine Comedy is a poem, right? So, but there is this gap between the artist and the work and the interpreter, which is another reason why we need good critics to help us interpret art.
Yeah.
But art can be misinterpreted. Great books can be misinterpreted and abused. We started this podcast by talking about how wonderful I think it is that young men are reading great books, but there are some kind of great books accounts that are pretty dark. And they spend the majority of their time just reading the most racist and misogynistic stuff into these classics. And, I think they're bad readers.
Yeah.
But there's always going to be that element of freedom. And so circling back around to the question, can virtue be taught? My answer to that question is yes, but it's complicated,
Yeah.
right? And it's complicated because of the ineliminable element of freedom in human transactions, and just the ineliminable, the sharp edge of that is that we can sin and we can fall away and we can fail, to pursue the good, to see what's true, to really appreciate what is beautiful in a way that is consonant with truth and goodness. We struggle. Different interpretations of that as Catholics, we can say that we struggle because of the effects of original sin. But that stuff is all really real.
Yeah.
But again, I would insist that the fact that people can misinterpret or abuse great books or great works of art is not a reason to say things like, well, obviously, this isn't about moral formation, or obviously, it doesn't undercut
Mm-hmm.
the reality that it can go well. The fact that it can go poorly does not undercut the reality that it's meant to go well.
Yes. Yeah. Very good. Very good. Jen, now I come to the part of the program where I want to ask you to pick your favorite children. What?
Wow, this got really hard, really fast.
Yeah, exactly. I want to end with a bang with my last two questions. So understanding your teaching, you establish this curriculum, of canonical texts, whether it be philosophical or literary, and so on. I want to ask you not just what should we be reading and why in and of itself based on what you teach. I want you to also dive into what's touched you. What it's like when you're teaching a class and then you come across that book or that excerpt that you're really passionate about because there's something that it resonates with you personally that just stands a little bit above some of the other things you're teaching. What should we, through the eyes of Dr. Jen Frey, what should we be reading and why?
Like literature or philosophy?
Well, I'll tell you what. Give me a couple of literature, since this is probably our main theme is the classics or the canon of great books, and then because you're a philosophy teacher or professor, say a couple on the philosophy side too, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure. So, in terms of literature, I really think, you should read some of the great novels, and I think you should read Madame Bovary by Flaubert. I think it's literally perfect, and so deep and important and wonderful. I do think you should read Dostoevsky. And although he's hard, but it rewards that effort. And then in terms of poetry, I do think you should read Homer and Virgil. There's so much depth there. And I also think you should read Milton. Paradise Lost is incredibly important for understanding modernity. And it's also just fantastic. And then I would recommend things that I think might surprise people and kind of gets into the whole dangers of reading, like Flaubert. His poetry is very dark. Dana Gioia argues it's Catholic. I think there's something to that. So I think, there's so much that I could say, but I think you just want to recognize that these are challenging texts.
Yeah.
They've been interpreted and reinterpreted in a variety of ways. You should approach them with humility. But insofar as they are recommended to you, it's because there is some kind of truth, right?
Yeah.
Like being explored there in a way that is literary. And that is a different way from philosophy. I'm a philosopher. I love philosophy, but philosophy was not my first love. I never even read any philosophy until I was 18. My first love was literature. Philosophy is much more abstract and general and is sort of like searching out for those first principles. But if you have a more kind of literary personality, then I think you want to start with Plato, right? Because Plato is a very literary philosopher. I think a lot of people struggle to read Aristotle. Now, I think Aristotle is a better philosopher than Plato, but he's not really inspiring. But honestly, I mean, any of the Platonic dialogues, I think the Apology is a great one to start with. But also the Protagoras, the Gorgias. I mean, these are amazing. The Phaedrus is one of my favorites. Republic's amazing. It's long, it's hard, but it's amazing. So definitely Plato. And gosh, who else would I recommend as a philosopher? Boy, I feel like a failure here.
No.
Am I allowed to can I recommend Aquinas? Like, he's not.
Yeah, of course. This is a Catholic podcast. Go for it. Dive in.
Yeah. So again, if you're more in the kind of Platonic vein, Augustine, definitely the Confessions. The Confessions, it's hard to say what it is.
Yeah.
It's a bit sui generis, frankly. Transcends all genres, or it made up its own genre, depending on how you want to think about it. But then Aquinas, I mean, I realized that I am somewhat peculiar, but I fell madly in love with Aquinas when I was 18. And this was very unexpected because I was an atheist. I didn't really, frankly, know many Catholics. But Aquinas is just an amazing thinker. And there's just so much there. And frankly, I don't think it's hard. And one reason why I don't think it's hard is because it's just in this dialectical format. And it's the same. And as soon as you understand what that kind of quaestio format is doing, you're off to the races. Yeah. You can do it. And it's so rich. And, I talk about rereading. I read Aquinas pretty much every day. Yeah. And I've been doing that my whole life. And I just highly recommend this to anyone.
Fantastic. Very Flannery O'Connor did it. I was going to say it's Flannery O'Connor and Bishop Barron. I mean, you're in very good company, or they're in very good company with you. I returning full circle to high school kid in his room with a stack of books, to a young college student pondering their major, to a graduate student kind of figuring out where they go. What advice do you, as a seasoned professor, speaking to just these topics we're talking about, what advice do you have to a young person who's trying to find their way with again, you talk about what they should read, but what encouragement can you give or advice you could give to them about the way forward in the tumultuous times we live in terms of the life of the mind?
I would say don't gamify your life. So don't measure your life by kind of external metrics, right? You really need to think about what is really going to bring your life meaning and purpose and a sense of joy, because life is really short and it's unpredictable and it can be taken from you with no warning. And really, at the end of the day, you don't get that much time. And if you live your life for things that are nice but are not fundamental, things like money or power or prestige, you're going to regret it. You're going to regret it. We have a whole cloud of witnesses reminding you that you're going to regret it, but you're just going to regret it. And if you really apply yourselves to the best things, you're going to be the kind of person who is really going to be set up to succeed. If you externalize everything, so that you're really only seeking instrumental goods, I think you're less likely to be successful, and you're also just going to be unhappy, and you're going to have a major midlife crisis. And I don't think you should want that. So I'm not just saying follow your passions, because your passions might be disordered and maybe you shouldn't follow them.
Yeah.
But I am saying that you should really go for the highest things in life, This is something that the ancients understood. They didn't open it to everyone, and I would. Um, but I think, go for those things. And it's not that you can't go wrong. Life's complicated, but it's a safer path than any other one.
Dr. Jennifer Frey, Catholic, philosopher, and lover of great literature, thank you so much for this conversation. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
It's been really fun. Thanks for having me.
So I've been thinking. In an interview in 2008 with Leslie Stahl on 60 Minutes, Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia described an indelible moment from his high school English class. Quote, "One teacher I remember was an elderly Jesuit at Xavier from Boston, Father Tom Matthews, and he taught me a lesson that I've recounted in some of my speeches. He taught me what I refer to as the Shakespeare principle. The class was reading one of the Shakespeare plays, Hamlet or whatever, and one of my classmates, John Antonelli, made some really smart aleck sophomore criticism of the play. And Father Matthews looked down at him and said with his Boston accent, 'Mister, when you read Shakespeare, Shakespeare's not on trial, you are.'" Close quote. Now I like that story. Shakespeare's not on trial, you are. If I've seen one theme about reading tremoring across media bigs like The Atlantic, The New York Times, or The Guardian, it has been the trepidation surrounding high school and college kids not being able to read novels. It's not just that they don't read, we are told, it is that they can't. Now, I don't get exasperated very often, but give me a break. This is not a crisis of capability, but a crisis of expectations. W.H. Auden, teaching an undergraduate English course at the University of Michigan in 1941, gave reading assignments that included St. Augustine's Confessions, Dante's Divine Comedy, Aeschylus's Orestia, Melville's Moby Dick, Dostoevsky's Notes from the Underground, and yes, 27 additional books for a total of 6,000 pages. In 1948, Vladimir Nabokov offered classes in Russian literature at Cornell, 2 of them in Russian, by the way, where students were expected to read Joyce's Ulysses, Flaubert's Madame Bovary, Dickens' Bleak House, and many, many more. The reading list was only part of the challenge. The questions demanded an uncanny degree of attention by their readers. Of Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, he thundered, "Describe the wallpaper in Karenin's bedroom." Respecting Madame Bovary, he asked, "Describe Emma's eyes, hands, sunshade, hairdo, dress, shoes." If we read the essays, wringing hands about modern college reading, then we are to believe that 1 or 2 novels in a semester will send a student straight to their campus comfort rooms where they will rock plaintively, surrounded by stuffed animals, bubbles, and oversized pillows. Enough. Antonin Scalia was once asked by a high school teacher in the presence of his history class which of the Federalist Papers his students should read. Apoplectic, Scalia stared in dismay. "All of them," he insisted. If we are about the vital business of forming the young and not deforming them, then we must challenge them to read what Matthew Arnold calls the best which has been thought and said. And that means, for a time, getting up early and staying up late, turning countless pages with pen in hand, reading and rereading, puzzling and painting, but ultimately experiencing epiphanies and arriving at wisdom. However, seeing young men in recent days recording videos gushing about the brothers Karamazov and Anna Karenina with enthusiasm is enough to give me hope for a brighter tomorrow. So let's ask, nay, let's demand that our young read the best which has been thought and said, and watch them come alive. After all, Shakespeare's not on trial. We are. And one last thing. Pick up a classic. I don't care which one, but perhaps a book you read in high school that you didn't quite understand or enjoy, and give it another shot. Hamlet, Crime and Punishment, Frankenstein, or The Great Gatsby. At the time that you read it, if it didn't resonate, remember Scalia's insight. You were on trial. By taking a look at it with new eyes as an engaging story, albeit with some work as these books can be challenging, old literature will come newly alive. And once you catch fire about great literature, I guarantee you, the blaze will only grow more bright. Thank you once again for joining me on the Evangelization Culture Podcast. I'm Tod Worner, and until we meet again, keep bringing Christ to a hungry culture.